Under a dark August sky in 1942, the sea roared wildly as rubber boats pitched and struggled against relentless waves after a brutal raid had spiraled far from the plan. The distant drone of Japanese seaplanes grew louder as the battered survivors of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion fought desperately to escape Makin Island. If the aircraft spotted the American submarines waiting offshore, the raiders' slim hopes would evaporate. Aboard USS Argonaut and USS Nautilus, crews worked feverishly, hauling drenched and weary Marines aboard as the first Japanese planes swept over the horizon. In a final frantic push, the last boatload of raiders was pulled from the churning surf. Not a moment too soon, the submarines submerged, out of sight. But something was wrong. As the raiders began to share their accounts of events, a grim realization dawned on them. 9 men were missing. The Marine Raiders tasked with raiding Makin Island were a special American covert unit designed to take the fight to the enemy in the most unconventional way possible. Inspired by the British commandos, these elite units were created to strike swiftly and decisively, targeting lightly defended Japanese-held islands scattered across the vast Pacific. Their formation was a response to Admiral Chester Nimitz's urgent call for forces capable of amphibious raids. From their inception in February 1942, the 1st and 2nd Raider Battalions were designed to be anything but typical. Specializing in small boat insertions, light infantry warfare, and daring operations behind enemy lines, they embraced innovation and risk. The man behind this concept was Major Evans Carlson, a man whose unorthodox ideas had reached all the way up to President Roosevelt. Carlson had fought in the trenches of France during World War I, earned the Navy Cross in Nicaragua, and witnessed firsthand the brutal tactics of the Imperial Japanese Army while serving as an intelligence officer in China. There, he absorbed the guerrilla warfare tactics of Chinese Communist forces and returned to America determined to prepare his nation for the incoming storm. He knew Japan was a threat, one that could not just be fought conventionally. Carlson's ideas often clashed with traditional military doctrine. His left-leaning politics and affinity for the Chinese communists made him a controversial figure, but his direct relationship with FDR gave him leverage to push boundaries. His raiders were less hierarchical, more focused on cohesion and what he called ethical indoctrination, ensuring every man knew why they fought and held those values dear. The command was based on merit and not rank. He reorganized the Marine squad structure into 10-man units centered on firepower, equipping his men with Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and M1 rifles. The spirit of his unit was encapsulated in the term gung-ho, a Chinese phrase meaning working together, which Carlson had adopted and infused with a sense of enthusiasm and purpose. This philosophy would face its ultimate test in the summer of 1942. While Edson's first raiders gained fame during the legendary defense of Edson's Ridge, Carlson's second raiders prepared for a bold strike, the raid on Makin Island. A speck of land in the Gilbert Chain, Makin Island seemed tailor-made for the raiders' daring strike. It was precisely what Nimitz had envisioned when calling for raids on lightly defended Japanese outposts. Occupied in December 1941, Makin was a Japanese seaplane base housing several reconnaissance aircraft that monitored all around the Gilbert Islands. Its garrison was a modest force of roughly 70 troops tasked with maintaining the planes and defending the atoll. While other potential targets, such as the Aleutian island of Attu, had been considered, they were deemed too heavily fortified and too far afield to serve the operation's purpose, drawing Japanese reinforcements away from Guadalcanal, where the more extensive campaign was unfolding. The raiders of the 2nd Marine Battalion, totaling 211 men, boarded 2 submarines, USS Argonaut and USS Nautilus, for their mission. Their orders were to land via rubber boats, destroy the Japanese seaplane base, eliminate the garrison, gather intelligence, and cause as much disruption as possible to draw the attention of all nearby Japanese troops. It was a bold plan, but fraught with challenges, not least of which was the inexperience of the Marines themselves. Carlson later admitted that few raiders had ever set foot on a submarine before, let alone trained for operations involving them. The raid was timed for August 17th, just 10 days after the initial Guadalcanal invasion. The objective was to make the Japanese believe that Makin was the prelude to more significant American offensives in the Gilberts. However, from the outset, things began to go south. The landing plan centered on LCRLs, large rubber rafts designed to carry 10 men and powered by small outboard motors. The original intent was for the raiders to embark on these rafts while the submarines submerged beneath them, creating a seamless launch. But on the morning of August 16th, after 9 days of cramped travel from Pearl Harbor, the raiders emerged to wild seas that churned with relentless swells. Worse still, a ceaseless driving rain, turning what was supposed to be a precise operation into a chaotic nightmare. Loading the boats became almost impossible. Equipment and supplies were swept away by the rising waves. The submarines were forced to abandon their planned procedure, lowering the rafts over the side into the tumultuous surf instead. The outboard motors proved no match for the conditions. Many became swamped, leaving the Marines to rely on paddles. In the darkness, drenched and disoriented, the raiders struggled to coordinate as they rowed their flimsy boats towards unmeasurable dangers. Carlson said it was a confused mess, with boats tumbling across the surf as the raiders struggled to stay afloat. The raiders stumbled ashore on Makin Island in disarray, their equipment battered and scattered by the waves. The darkness was impenetrable. In Carlson's words, as dark as the inside of a black cow. Tensions were high after such a chaotic landing, but the frustration reached a fever point when a Marine accidentally discharged his weapon, risking the entire operation in a split second. Boats were missing, including one carrying Lieutenant Oscar Petros, the commander of Company B. In the chaos, Petros and his men, unaware of a last-minute change, landed at a secondary beach only to find themselves completely isolated. Meanwhile, the rest of the raiders landed at Beach Z, hiding their rafts under palm fronds and bracing for action. As dawn broke, Carlson rallied his scattered force, radioing the Nautilus with the grim assessment that the landing had been lousy. Despite the confusion, the raiders pressed inland, guided by friendly island natives who revealed the location of the Japanese garrison. Almost immediately, they encountered sniper fire. The raiders moved as fast as they could to neutralize the sniper threat before it took its toll. Sergeant Clyde Thomason, towering at 6'4", a height that required a special waiver to join the raiders, ran up to a house concealing a sniper, breached the door open, and gunned down the enemy in a burst of gunfire just as he was fixing his aim on a fellow raider. The raiders spotted a Japanese truck carrying reinforcements. Dean Winters of Company A fired a boy's anti-tank rifle, the so-called elephant gun, striking the truck and sending Japanese soldiers spilling out. Then the engine exploded violently. Thomason quickly organized his men into a defensive horseshoe formation, anticipating the inevitable counterattack. When the Japanese charged with fixed bayonets in a ferocious banzai charge, the raiders held their ground, cutting down the attackers with disciplined, controlled fire. For Sergeant Thomason, the only response to a chaotic banzai charge was a calculated and calm response that negated the psychological impact of the Japanese tactic. But after halting the charge, the advancing raiders stumbled into another enemy trap. Machine guns opened up from hidden positions, pinning the raiders down. Carlson's men flanked and neutralized the threat, but not without cost. Thomason, a linchpin of the unit's morale, was taken down by a sniper as he exposed himself to draw enemy fire away from his men. The battle devolved into a brutal sniper engagement, later named the Battle of the Breadfruit Trees. Japanese marksmen targeted squad leaders, radio operators, and even medics, forcing them to remove Red Cross armbands. The situation was further complicated when Japanese seaplanes arrived, strafing the raiders and forcing the American submarines to dive for safety. The raiders retaliated with machine guns and anti-tank rifles, shooting down two planes, a Nakajima E-8N Dave and a massive Kawanishi H-8K Emily. The destruction of the aircraft was a rare success amid growing uncertainty. After such a harrowing start, and unaware the Japanese garrison was nearly annihilated, Carlson faced mounting pressure. With high surf making a return to the submarines treacherous and the risk of Japanese reinforcements looming, he made the difficult decision to attempt withdrawal under cover of darkness. If he had pushed just a little farther, his force would have quickly captured the Japanese base and its airfield, as just a handful of enemy soldiers were manning the defenses. Despite their losses and exhaustion, the raiders had wreaked havoc on the island. They located and burned over 1,000 barrels of Japanese aviation fuel, ensuring that the island's utility to the enemy would be severely diminished. As the raiders rushed back towards the submarines, only a fraction of the force made it through the pounding waves to the vessels. Unable to raise the Nautilus or Argonaut on the radio, Carlson and over 120 stranded raiders spent a harrowing night, hungry, wet, and exhausted. By morning, communication was re-established with the Argonaut. Lieutenant Petros and Major Roosevelt orchestrated a daring plan to evacuate the remaining raiders, knowing the Japanese could send reinforcements that very day. As evening fell, using their lashed-together rafts and two native outrigger canoes, the wounded and weary raiders paddled back to the submarines under the cover of darkness. With Japanese planes patrolling the skies, the submarines couldn't risk remaining in the open during daylight. As the 120 men made it into the vessels, the submarines immediately dove, and just a Japanese patrol boat plane made it to the area. Carlson was sure that all of the 30 Marines who were missing had fallen on the island. Yet, as the submarines left the atoll and the men shared their accounts of events, the grim realization that they had left 9 men stranded on the island emerged. Carlson tried to have the submarines turned around, but the risks were too great. For years, the fate of the 9 Marines remained a mystery until intercepted Japanese communications unveiled their harrowing story. Stranded deep in hostile territory and realizing there was no rescue coming, the group fractured. 4 of the raiders chose to surrender. They made their way to the coast, where they signaled their intentions to a Japanese patrol plane in the distance. But the remaining 5 were determined to defy the odds. They hatched a daring plan. Under the cloak of night, they seized a small trading yacht, the Kariyama Kingo, property of the South Seas Trading Company. The wharf fell silent behind them as they set out, their only chance lying in the treacherous waters ahead. They navigated the yacht toward what they believed to be a narrow escape route on the western side of the atoll. Suddenly, the hull scraped against the unseen labyrinth of reefs and hidden sandbanks, lodging the vessel in place and completely ruining their escape plans. Stranded once more, they abandoned the yacht, plunging into the sea. Swimming and wading through hostile waters, they clawed their way to the shore. Dawn broke, revealing their location. Japanese soldiers swept in and captured them before they could hide again. Japanese reports reveal the American POWs were taken to Kwajalein Atoll, where they were imprisoned and interrogated for 6 weeks. The local commander wanted to send them to the mainland of Japan, as Kwajalein was on the fringes of Japanese territory and could be lost at any moment. When his request was denied, he ordered their execution by master swordsmen near the western shore of the atoll. The raiders were buried, and flowers were offered as part of Japanese tradition. The debate over whether the Makin Island raid was a success or failure continues to this day. Tactically, the raiders had annihilated the Japanese garrison, sunk 2 vessels, destroyed 2 seaplanes, and eliminated over 1,000 barrels of critical aviation fuel. Although they failed to capture prisoners, they did seize valuable intelligence about Japanese defenses in the Gilbert Islands. Strategically, however, the raid didn't achieve its primary objective of diverting reinforcements from Guadalcanal. Still, the raid was a powerful propaganda victory at a time when the nation desperately needed good news. Dr. Stephen Stigler, the raiders' surgeon, recalled the emotional reception they received upon their return to Pearl Harbor. By the time we got abreast of the first ship, they were standing at attention saluting us. Each ship we passed saluted us. They were playing the Marine Corps hymn and they were cheering. It was all very emotional. However, the cost of the mission was sobering, especially when the story of the remaining 9 raiders came to light. In 1947, Japanese Admiral Koso Abe was convicted of war crimes and paid with his life for these executions. For their bravery, Carlson was awarded his 2nd Navy Cross, and Major Roosevelt and Lieutenant Pete Ross received the same honor. Sergeant Clyde Thomason was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Marine of World War II to receive it.